Hello, everyone. Now, when it comes to citing research in your essays, unless you're summarizing a large section of a source, you're going to be doing one of two things. You'll be quoting the source directly with quotation marks, or paraphrasing, putting the source's ideas into your own words. Now, in this video, we'll go over the technical rules for both quoting and paraphrasing. But I'm going to warn you up front, this is not super interesting. We're looking at technical rules here, so don't expect sunshine and lollipops. Now, that being said, this info is very important and worth remembering because we use it in practice very often in academic writing. So without further ado, let's start by looking at the technical rules for quoting our sources. Once you've found a good quote to use in your paper, the first thing you may have to do is modify it, using square brackets, single quotation marks, and ellipses where necessary. So for example, I want to quote Harold Hood, who writes, "I believe that calcium is the vital ingredient for human happiness and well-being." Now, I can't say I believe that because what do I know about calcium? I didn't say this. So I need to alter the quote. Hood believes that calcium is the vital ingredient for human happiness and well-being. I'm using square brackets within the quote to show that I made a change to that original passage. Okay, so let's say I don't need all of the information here. Happiness and well-being sounds a little redundant. So I'm going to cut that word out, and in this case, I'm going to use ellipses, my 3 dots, to show the reader that I've taken something out of the original passage. Ta-da! Last thing, let's say I'm quoting a source that has quotation marks within that original passage. So my original source says, Harold Hood believes that calcium is, quote, the vital ingredient for human happiness and well-being. Now, I'm citing the source about, not written by Hood in this case. The source is quoting Hood, not me. So I'm going to write, Harold Hood believes that calcium is, single quotes here, is the vital ingredient for human happiness and well-being. In this case, I'm using those single quotation marks within my quotation to show that this is a quote within a quote. Sound good? Okay, let's move on to our next rule. Sometimes students will quote something in their papers without any lead-in to the quote. The quote just sort of sits there alone in the middle of the paragraph, really lonely looking. They may cite the source after the quote in parentheses, but it creates a big tonal difference between the student's original writing and that quoted passage. So to solve this problem, we can introduce the quote using an introductory phrase, also known as a signal phrase. According to Harold Hood, and then we have our quote, or Hood argues that, and then our quote. Now, if your reader has no idea who this Hood fellow is or why they should care about his thoughts on calcium, we can also use an identifying phrase to establish his credibility. According to Harold Hood, a professor of life sciences at the University of Vermont, calcium is the vital ingredient for human happiness and well-being. Now, if the source is an academic, like Harold Hood, we could mention their university, their rank, their department. If the source is a journalist, we could mention the newspaper or magazine for which they write. Some professors want you to mention the full article title here in text, but in my opinion, that's usually a giant waste of space. I can check that in your works cited page at the end of the paper. For a good identifying phrase, all we really need is something brief, usually just one point, that's enough to show the authority of the person we're citing. And after we use that identifying phrase once, we don't need to repeat it every time we cite that source. We'll just refer to the source by their last name from there on out. Our next technical rule is to limit our quotation to around 15% of a paragraph. Now, there are exceptions to this rule, of course. If you're analyzing a lengthy passage in detail, it may be necessary to quote that passage in full. But generally, we want to be very selective with our quotes and make sure that our voice is the dominant stylistic voice in the paragraph. Finally, we always have to cite our sources twice, both in text and in our works cited if we're using MLA format. Now, in this case, it looks like we're citing a book. So that means we should have a page number in our in-text citation. And if I decide I don't want to mention the author directly in my sentence for whatever reason, I also need to put the author's name in parentheses as well. Okay, how are we doing out there? Have I lost you? No? We're all okay? Good. So again, these are the technical rules to know and love when it comes to quoting sources. Modify, intro, limit, cite. Or milk, with a C. Sometimes I find that making up a little song or jingle about something helps me to remember it better. So I'm going to use one of those neat AI programs to write a catchy little song to help us remember our milk rules. Okay, here it is.
Stand and fight, modify your own limit sight. Quoting sources, rules are clear. Drink your milk and have no fear. Modify, with the quotes reshape the true. Intro, reveal your source, command and proof. Limit, don't lose your voice inside the mix. One side is short, but also in text.
That was not what I was going for. But let's just move on and talk about our other method for citing evidence in our essays, paraphrasing. Now, there are two basic technical rules for paraphrasing. One, we need to change both the words and the syntax or word order of the original passage. Let's look at an example. My original passage reads, "The researchers reached the conclusion that kale is an excellent source of calcium." And our paraphrase reads, "The researchers came to the conclusion that kale is a terrific source of calcium." Anastasio and Fishman, page 46. So, what do we think of the paraphrase? Well, it's not great. The words and syntax are pretty much identical to the original, so we're technically plagiarizing the source here because it's too similar to that original passage. How about this one? Again, my original, the researchers reached the conclusion that kale is an excellent source of calcium. My paraphrase, the scientists decided that kale provides lots of calcium. What do we think about this one? Well, we've changed more of the words, but is the syntax or word order really all that different? Not at all. One more example. Again, our original is the researchers reached the conclusion that kale is an excellent source of calcium. And our paraphrase, after analyzing the data, it was clear to the researchers where humans can get more calcium, kale. All right, now here you can see the words and syntax are very different, to the point where there's even a tonal and stylistic difference from the original, setting up that kind of surprise about kale at the end of the sentence. So once we paraphrase sufficiently, we still need to cite the source in text and in a works cited page, even if we put the source into our own words, because we're citing the ideas here, not just the words of the sources we use in research. All right, sound good? Well, then one final tip when it comes to paraphrasing, be very careful to avoid what's often called in the writing biz the patchwork paraphrase. Now, this is when some parts of a source have been paraphrased, well, but certain clauses and phrases from that original source haven't been changed at all. And because you haven't paraphrased them, well, this is still considered a form of plagiarism, even if it's unintentional. And just to show you how dangerous this can be, I'm going to throw caution to the wind and ask AI to write me a song about the dangers of the patchwork paraphrase. Let's have a listen.
If you patchwork paraphrase, you'll smell so bad. Your spouse will leave, and that's just sad. You'll be constipated and lose a tooth. You need to paraphrase right. Baby, that's the truth.
Okay, that is not... No. The point in all this is to avoid accusations of plagiarism and make sure our essays are technically proficient. We need to follow the rules of quotation and paraphrase in all cases. That's all for now. Good luck with your writing, and thanks as always for tuning in.
If you patchwork paraphrase, you'll smell so bad.